And welcome back. Now, as we come to the end of Tourism Month here in South Africa, there's no doubt that the global industry has suffered irreparable financial loss because of the worldwide coronavirus pandemic and, of course, the subsequent lockdowns. And with some international travel opening up from this Thursday, that's the 1st of October, there are hopes that many of South Africa's famed tourist destinations will successfully reopen. So to discuss this, we're joined now by South Africa's Tourism Chief Executive Officer, Sisa Ntshona. Thanks so much for your time. Welcome to Morning Live.
Morning, Sakina. Thank you.
Ms. Ntshona, firstly, let's talk about the devastation that was visited upon tourism as a sector. 6 whole months in lockdown. So how has that basically hit the industry?
Yeah, it's been devastating, not only to South Africa, but globally. We've seen, at some stage up to 90% of all airlines being grounded. We've seen the chain hotels also coming to a halt as well. And it's been absolutely devastating. So on one hand, where, many of the tourism activities continue with having overheads of cost, building maintenance, etc., there's just simply no revenue line at all. So it is with much relief, I think, that we are now starting to open up and recover the sector. But there's still some ground to cover before we get to normality as well.
Indeed. But talking about, this reopening and happening in a phased approach, of course, since we saw interprovincial resume in a lockdown level 2, did local travel actually see any vast boost in the industry? Was there any significant increase, Cesar?
Yeah, no. So we took the time during the pandemic to actually come up with a recovery plan, looking through the storm, as it were. And one of the facets that we came up that there will be pent-up demand, and once the sector opens, we'll see a flurry rush, essentially. So when we opened up the stages, the first stage was just business travel and no interprovincial travel. It really started having a big impact when all domestic travel was allowed. I mean, to give an example, the night the president announced that interprovincial travel is allowed, the SANParks booking site literally crashed. That was just a flurry of people coming to book, basically, to go to all of our parks. So, and we've seen that momentum continue as well. Just this long weekend, preliminary reports such as it was all chock-a-block, travel to KZN, travel to Mpumalanga, travel to Western Cape as well. Again, it's people mostly expressing their freedom and really stretching their legs a bit.
Indeed. And of course, as you say, it isn't business as usual. So what are some of the precautions and also extra measures that tourists and the industry have had to take in order to get us some form of a semblance of normalcy as we go about our travels?
Absolutely. Great question, because we'll still have to remember that we are in lockdown. Let's also take some of the lessons that we've noticed in the Northern Hemisphere, essentially what not to do. We are heading towards our summer season. We cannot at all afford to kind of let our guard go, because otherwise the consequences may be dire over there. South Africa is receding quite nicely in terms of number of positive cases relative to other countries. At some stage we're number 5, I think now we're number 10, and essentially want to come down that line. The industry has instituted health and safety protocols, and I must say, I don't know about you, but I probably get my temperature taken 20 times a day, write my name 20 times a day. But that's just the times that you're in for the tracking and tracing as well. So health and safety protocols in place to ensure that we've got mitigating circumstances should something occur.
So now we're looking at international borders also being opened. So when international travel does resume on Thursday, Cesar, what are you expecting? The list of countries that will be allowed in and out, that not yet published, but what are your expectations for Thursday?
Yeah, the magical list that everyone wants to have a look at, essentially. Look, I think regarding that list in itself, it's not a very difficult kind of exercise to kind of have a sense in terms of how it's going to go through. And essentially saying those high-risk countries will have more stringent kind of criteria than the less risk countries there. We are essentially thrilled that international borders are opening on 1st of October, but we are also cautious that we're not going to see a sudden flurry of people coming through. Our key source markets, such as Europe and the US, are also under pressure. In fact, they're going down their own lockdown as well. So whilst we may be ready, we also have to be cognizant of the target countries, their ability to travel to South Africa. Secondly, as well, we have to reintroduce South Africa to the world again and connect it via airlines. So there's a lot of negotiation happening at the back end to make sure we get that network in place so that we can have freedom of travel as well. So it's going to be a cautious start. It's a great statement that South Africa is open from 1st of October, but we'll be surveying then on a monthly basis to make sure that we do it steadily, but also essentially getting that forex that we need for balance of payments as a country.
So, Sisa, as you say, the list, but of course, common sense also will prevail to a certain extent. But is there any sort of guide? Are you able to help people further understand on what basis people from certain countries may or may not be allowed in? And also, who ultimately gets to make that decision?
I'll start with the last question. The cabinet ultimately makes that decision. But I think as a guide, is walking that tightrope between saving lives and livelihoods. And that's essentially what the focus will be on. You simply don't want us to regress as a country to level 4 and 3 and 5, as an example. We've just come too far. We've sacrificed quite a lot. So we've got to protect that as much as we can. But at the same time, be cognizant that we need to let the wheels of the economy start moving again. Because tourism is such a great enabler and contributor to the economy, and also jobs within that space. So we want to open up, but to be careful not to import risk in that takes us back as a country.
So are we likely to see any further, more detailed guidelines as we open up internationally?
Absolutely. It's an ongoing environment. Again, just looking up north and seeing some of the lessons there, they literally issue a list every week in terms of Europe as to which countries are in the red zone, or yellow zone, or green zone. And that's all dependent on the pandemic trajectory in the specific country as well. So that becomes important. We also need to be aware how South Africa is rated by also countries overseas. So if we are on the non-travel list, as an example, it doesn't matter how open we are. The citizens won't be able to travel to our country. So you've got to look at it on both sides all of the time. And as you rightfully said, you can have a methodology, but some sort of common logic and common sense rather needs to be applied in order to make sure that, we don't mess it up, as it were.
And then looking at the airports, and we have seen 3 of those airports, that would be OR Tambo, Cape Town, and the King Shaka International Airport in Durban. They are ready for flights coming through there. But there are, of course, still concerns, these are about social distancing measures. Are you working closely with the Department of Transport in this regard? And what sort of discussions have you had with them?
Absolutely. I mean, the whole opening up of the sector cuts across the board in terms of all the ministries and departments to make sure all of the efforts come into place. Yes, Department of Transport for actually airports and flights and everything else there, but also Home Affairs, an example, for visa processing and also migration, et cetera, in that regard. So all of this needs to really kind of come together. It's been done slowly, it's been done cautiously so that lessons can be learned and rectified as we go along. As I said, we don't expect on 1st of October to have hundreds of thousands of people kind of coming to our shores immediately, but also it's a great way, again, to open up the country and start to assess it.
But what is out there? Are there any carrots, dangling for local tourists who now have an opportunity to go around because you can't go outside of the country? Anything special, price-wise, anything that we can take up right now as South Africans?
Absolutely. We've seen a flurry of specials coming right across the board because what the COVID has done in the recovery is that it's pressed a reset button. So everyone has to recalibrate on pricing. And for the foreseeable future, all of the tourism industry will really get its bread and butter from domestic side. So it will not be in their best interest to actually outprice themselves out of the market. What we've seen, however, is that you're getting your traditional domestic tourists, continuing, but also those that used to go overseas for their holidays are now looking inwardly and suddenly filling that gap a bit, in terms of the one that's been left, by the international tourist side. So all of that is starting to be recalibrated. And I think in the next couple of weeks, we'll be seeing more and more specials, targeted at South Africans, but also highlighting those rural hidden gems, as it were, so that they also get, their time in the sun, as it were, for South Africans to discover those small villages, full dorpies, rural side, and really immerse yourself in the culture of South Africa.
So this is the time when I can go to Mala Mala that I obviously cannot afford ever in outside of lockdown. Would I be able to afford it now?
I don't know. Depends how much you're willing to pay, I suppose, as well. As I said, the pricing will be recalibrated based on supply and demand. There are wealthy South Africans that probably can afford it and probably will take it up, So it's about looking at it that there's something for everybody right across the spectrum within South Africa. So whether you've got deep pockets, sure, but also the middle market and also the low market, there's something for everybody.
I'll certainly check it out. But of course, employment as well, Sisa. Many people have lost their job in this industry because of the lockdown. But what is it looking like now? Is it starting to pick up?
It's starting to pick up because remember that, especially in tourism, that jobs are the consequence of productivity. So the busier the sector gets, it can quickly absorb jobs, but also at the same time can quickly let go of jobs if, the level of activity goes down. So we are seeing very good numbers coming through now, but we're quite cautious. A lot of people got laid off, during that quiet period as well. And so some of them have been clawed back, but we are nowhere near the levels that we were previously before COVID as well.
And just the final questions. In terms of percentage, what percentage of the industry are likely to recover, and in what period do you expect that to happen, assuming that we don't have a second wave of COVID-19, of course?
Sure. We simulated that each month, essentially, that goes by and the sector remains, not allowed to operate, you're probably losing about 5% a month in terms of the supply side, the product side. These are businesses either that have decided to close or have mothballed themselves, essentially. The real test is right now, as the sector opens up. We've seen some that are actually just switched on and come back on again. Some are taking a bit longer to get in on board. Some are only opening up on 1st of October. So this is a monthly assessment of the product side, the supply side, to make sure that as we go back to the world, we do have all of the products that we had previously and more in order to showcase to the world.
Well, Sisa, thanks so much for speaking to us. Sisa Ntshona is the CEO of SA Tourism, discussing international travel and tourism, which will be allowed from this Thursday, the 1st of October, and also more broadly what is happening in the sector. And I must just say, Leanne, it's amazing trying to book, as Sisa also pointed out, just trying to make a booking for a restaurant. It is not as easy as you think. Yeah. It is quite fully booked at this point.